Hi, welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. We're still in Germany. Another story from this country. This is a story about a certain nurse. A little boy, was born in the city of Wilhelmshaven, that's in Lower Saxony, a port city. A boy who grew up in a Catholic family. They had traditional Catholic values, a believing, practicing family. Little Nils, because that was his name, was also raised in this Catholic faith as he grew up. I would also say she had a rather unique approach to the world, a bit different from the typical attitude. They believed that the longer a child stayed at home, the less exposed it would be to various kinds of stress related to going out into the world and being bombarded by all sorts of negative stimuli. Therefore, they decided to keep Nils at home, with the idea that the whole family would educate and raise him. It was an intellectual family. The mother was a legal advisor. The father and grandmother were nurses, so they handled everything without any problems. They wanted to spare little Nils the hardships of the world so that he would enter it as late as possible. And so it happened that little Nils was practically at home under the care of his parents and grandparents until he was 11 years old. But before Nils Hogel, because that was also his name, grew up, the first critical situation occurred in his life. Well, his parents decided to separate, not in the sense that they would get a divorce. They decided more that they would spend some time apart, that they would be in a kind of separation, that they would get some distance from their marriage and see what happens, what will happen next. And little Nils took it very hard because practically the whole time he was at home under the care of his family. And suddenly he realized that what had been happening for the last 11 years didn't have to be permanent. That it could be something that could be taken away from him. Such a happy childhood surrounded by loving people, he was deeply affected by it. He started to show signs. There were some depressive states, anxiety states. On one hand, he had already started school by then. On one hand, there were those depressive and anxious states. He couldn't really cope with all of it. But on the other hand, nobody at school knew about it. He played the role of the class clown perfectly. He fooled around while the class waited for his performances to impress, amaze, or shock them. And they would see some new story connected with Nils. Well, those were, of course, some school pranks that everyone was waiting for. He was alone in all of this, because that's also important in this story later on what happened. He also found his own place in all of this. He knew he was the center of attention, that his classmates, the girls and boys, were waiting for him to show up again with some kind of act. Well, he felt important because everyone was waiting for him. They were expecting him. As if it was a performance by some actor who brings emotions to people. Years passed, Nils grew up and he wanted to do something with his life. At first, like many boys, he wanted to be a firefighter. However, it turned out that he had some dizziness, so he couldn't become a firefighter. So he decided that he would go into medicine, that he would become a doctor, that he would heal people. And in fact, he even got into medical school. He started his studies, but then eventually it became clear he was too weak and the studies were too much for him. The exams were too difficult. There were a lot of exams. He couldn't keep up with the studies. He wasn't able to pass all those exams, and came to the conclusion that medical studies weren't for him and he had to choose something else. And he had a family tradition because both his father and grandmother were nurses. He decided that he would become a nurse. Even his family was happy. because after all, they had a tradition. They knew what this profession involved. That is a profession of public trust. So everyone was happy. He really started learning the nursing profession. And here he actually managed. He passed the exams. He liked that. In 1997, he already had internships. 2 years later, that was 1999, he already had his diploma. And then he got a job at a clinic in Oldenburg, and he just started working there. After about 2 years, because it was 2001, the head of that clinic called an emergency meeting. He stated that something bad was happening in the hospital because the number of deaths had increased. And these were deaths that shouldn't have happened because people were coming to this clinic. Sometimes they came in with ailments that weren't life-threatening. And suddenly it turned out that these people were in a terminal state, and many of them died. After the meeting, they compiled some statistics, since those are needed, were being kept, and it turned out that 60% of those deaths occurred, or those people died, when Nils was on duty. Well, that certainly gave them something to think about. That's when Nils was transferred. First, he was on sick leave for 3 weeks. I think he got scared himself that something was happening around him. It was hard to hide that it was about him, but after 3 weeks, he came back. Then, the management of that clinic in Oldenburg transferred him to anesthesiology. And that's where he started working. It turned out again that while he was in anesthesiology, deaths started happening again. It was a surprising situation, even though everything seemed obvious, that the deaths of these patients, that they died simply because, in quotation marks, they were being cared for by Nils. Also, when Nils was at the clinic in Oldenburg, he ended up in a very difficult ward. This is ward number 211. This is a ward kind of like intensive care in the Polish sense. Every day there was a fight for human life. The mortality rate remained high since these were often hopeless cases. Often the surgeries were very complicated, among others on open hearts. And it turned out that Nils was experiencing this very traumatically. Especially those surgeries that were on an open heart. He couldn't cope with the trauma. He couldn't handle the sight of those surgeries. And again, all those depressive and anxious states appeared. Those states that were present earlier during childhood, at the time when his parents were separated. That's when he started drinking alcohol. It started with a little alcohol, then gradually increased. Well, as it usually is with alcohol, at first it helps. And after some time, it even made all those feelings stronger. He just couldn't handle it all. Something bad was happening to him. But coming back to that summary, by the management in Oldenburg, well, they probably came to some conclusions here. But those conclusions didn't lead to anything. However, Nils received an ultimatum. He was told that he had to resign from the clinic, that he had to work somewhere else. In exchange for that, he got a 3-month notice, a 3-month severance. And indeed, in October, that was already the year 2002, he left that clinic, but when he was leaving, he got something else. He simply got excellent references. The head nurse wrote that he was a great professional, fighting for human life, that he makes the right decisions. He actively gets involved in saving people. Even there, that statement was made. That moral factor is at the highest level for him. He got excellent references, so he was able to get a job without any problem. And he got a new job, this time at another clinic in Delmenhorst. That's in the suburbs of Bremen. And that's where he started working. And again in that clinic in Delmenhorst. It turned out that at the moment when Nils appeared there, the number of deaths increased. People started dying, sometimes in trivial cases. Sometimes no one knew why. Very quickly, the heads of the clinic realized that something bad was happening, but they had no evidence. Also, the doctors, nurses who worked in that clinic, they linked those deaths to Nils's appearance. But there was basically no real connection. Some thought he was just an unlucky man. A so-called Jonah, meaning someone who brings bad luck to others. And he himself comes out unscathed. However, there were also people who started to suspect something. Some deaths seemed almost unbelievable to them, likely because they involved people who came to the clinic with some trivial ailments. And honestly, nothing bad should have happened to them. And yet they died. There were also situations like that, I would say extreme ones, that Nils himself was involved in all this for quite a long time, that he was the one performing the resuscitation. He was restoring people's health in such a way that someone would suddenly collapse, that they would experience some kind of agonal states. Nils would appear. He would revive him, but after a few hours, the same person would collapse and return to an agonal state. Nils would appear again. He would bring him back to life again. And so it happened 3 times. But after the 4th resuscitation, that man simply didn't survive. Well, it was bizarre. Because in all of this, in the vast majority, in the number of these cases where people were dying, Nils would appear. Well, Nils in that clinic, he worked there calmly for 3 years. There was a lot of talk. People whispered, some wrote reports, asking for explanations about some of the deaths. Well, that's a fact. That some of the deaths were hard to explain. Often these were people, sickly, elderly, and to be honest, in those cases, such an explanation for why this person died was almost impossible. But finally the day came. June 22nd, it's already the year 2005. A nurse enters the room where the patients are lying. And she sees that Nils is leaning over one of the patients and he's injecting something from a syringe into the pump. She was surprised because this patient wasn't supposed to receive any injections, any medications, or any such orders. She asked Nils what he was doing. He didn't answer, but the nurse wrote a report about it, that he was injecting something into the patient's pump. That report reached the clinic management, and the clinic management was wondering what to do about all this. Well, here we go again, probably the false good of the clinic, just like with the first one. It caused this movement. The police didn't act immediately, despite clear evidence that Nils was involved. Somehow contributed to the deaths of patients at this clinic. And finally, however, the management came to the conclusion that this case and those other cases, the information coming from doctors and nurses couldn't be ignored. And indeed, the police were notified. Of course, an investigation was launched, but the investigation didn't move at any special pace. First, they conducted examinations. Those cases in the second clinic in Delmenhorst, but after just a few checks, it turned out that indeed Nils was responsible for the death of one patient. That was proven against him. Then in 2006, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison and a 5-year ban from practicing his profession. But also, the investigation was ongoing the whole time, and they returned to those cases from that first clinic in Oldenburg. Well, there again, there weren't any special results, but again, they found one case, and this time he got a second sentence. That second sentence was already 7 years of imprisonment and a lifetime ban of practicing the profession. Well, the investigators suspected, they knew, they were certain that there had to be more cases. They began analyzing other cases and digging deeper, but it was difficult again. These were intensive care units where people's deaths was something. I would say it was an everyday occurrence and a nightly one. There were quite a lot of such cases. But all the time, at that time, he was serving a prison sentence. The investigators were also counting on that. That at some point he would simply break. He would start talking. That he would want to somehow try to negotiate here, maybe get better conditions in prison or some other things, that they would just come to an agreement with him, something like that, that he would admit to some of the cases. And then the investigation will cover more, it will be broader, there will be more cases, and they'll prove more murders against him. Actually, Nils does help the investigators a bit in solving some of these situations. In fact, they come across them. They come across 3 more murders in those clinics and 2 attempted murders. So at this point, there are already 5 murders and 2 attempted murders. But for the investigators, it still seems like it's not enough. They start talking to him. They slowly get into his motivations. So, do you remember? When he was still in school, he was considered to be that kind of person. A person around whom a lot of situations revolved. He was considered the class clown, but also his friends and classmates always waited for his next prank. He was at the center of attention, and what was in childhood carried over into his work in that clinic. Because he, as he said, well, he often did that simply out of boredom, just to be the center of attention, just so that he would be. This time it was already adult colleagues, doctors, nurses, male nurses, who were watching him. He was injecting people who sometimes came in with those kinds of complaints, basically with nothing serious. He was injecting various kinds of medicines, for example, for heart arrhythmia, for low blood pressure, and those people, while being basically healthy, they were suffering. Then he started to save that person, and those who surrounded him waited for the result. Would he manage to save the person or not? Sometimes he succeeded, and sometimes no, but in reality he was the one causing this crisis situation. He was on the brink of life and death for them. He did that to people, to be the center of attention. That too. The investigators realized it even earlier, that you can't leave those. Almost all cases of death that occurred in these clinics, that this team of investigators is needed. It needs to be bigger with more investigators. There must be more of them. That these cases need to be subjected to such a detailed analysis. And a special team was appointed, which was called Nomen Omen Cardio. And this team of investigators was supposed to deal with explaining these cases of people's deaths. In these 2 clinics, investigators overall, with the participation, of course, of experts, because expert doctors were helping all the time, they decided that it was necessary to analyze 500 cases of people's deaths in these 2 clinics. And a gigantic amount of work began. It led to exactly 134 exhumations in 67 cemeteries. But these weren't just cemeteries in Germany. It turned out that they weren't just German citizens. There were also Turks. There were also Poles, as it was determined. The victims of this devilish nurse, because that's what he was called, the devilish nurse. These victims came from several countries. They were in a certain age range, from 34 to 96 years old. It was confirmed, indeed. In the bodies of these people, substances that he administered, and normally substances that shouldn't have been given to them, because they endangered their lives. In many cases, it was also impossible to determine. The bodies were already badly decomposed, making it impossible to determine why these people died, though we can guess. They died because of that too. They were killed by that devilish nurse altogether in January. It's 2018 already. Nils was charged. The murder of 100 people. 100 people, 64 Dolmerhorst. So in that second clinic, and 34 in Oldenburg. That many people. It was possible. It was determined that that many people were definitely killed by his hand. In fact, investigators assumed that he killed around 300 people. In the remaining cases, they couldn't prove his guilt. That was the investigation. Those weren't just charges against him, but they were also charges for the people who somehow covered things up. Because after all, they had reports. They had to know what was happening in the clinic, or at least suspect it. They should have been forwarded to superiors or the prosecutor's office, and investigations should have begun sooner. Before more murders happened. The final verdict, it's already 2019. Nils was also examined by doctors, by expert psychiatrists. They determined that he was fully aware of everything he was doing. However, he is a person completely lacking any empathy. A liar, a pathological liar. And here he just killed without any remorse or any scruples. Doctor, in June 2019, he said, that's such an enormity of evil. He had never seen anything like it in his career, that it's hard for him to talk about this case. He struggles to judge. In the end, it turned out that it was proven against him, and that's how it stayed. He was found guilty of 85 murders. But as I said, of course, there had to be a lot more. In the end, this devilish nurse, he was sentenced to life in prison, and that's how the story ends. I would say the greatest criminal in post-war German history, a serial killer. This story shook all of Germany. No one suspected that the person was capable of this, of such cruelty. And this was a man who theoretically should have brought people hope. This is how the story ends. A 42-year-old nurse, Nils, a man who, for 11 years, he was raised by his family, sheltered so that he wouldn't experience any negative stimuli from the outside world. And that's the story. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and as always, take care. And see you in Poland.